Now that we're done with learning about the nuts and bolts for the course that included neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and neurotransmitter systems, we are moving on to start discussing the different disorders for the rest of this course, basically. And the first of those is going to be depression, clinical depression, from unipolar to bipolar to postpartum. This portion of the mental disorder lectures or course is going to be meatier, more material than probably any other disorder. And that is for several reasons, which I'm hoping you will recognize as we move on. And I'm going to require that you become familiar with not only the symptoms and classifications of it, not DSM, because that's not something I'm interested in you nailing down for this, but treatments, including the medications and other treatments, as well as the theories of why depression occurs. So, having said that, let's get started with our notes. And again, just to remind you, I am never going to ask you to memorize statistics for 3 reasons. One, you can look in different sources and find different statistics. They're generally close, but not all the same. Secondly, they change. And third, because there are more important things for you to memorize. And it's more important to me that you just understand the prevalence, the extent to which these different disorders intrude on our societies and on our personal lives, so that it is easy to see why it's important to work at coming up with treatments and maybe someday a complete cure. Okay, so first let's define depression. And I want to start by mentioning reactive sadness or depression. This is not what we're going to be talking about. This particular sadness or depression is in response to stress or another negative experience or experiences. And this type of depression is transient. Can be anything from a few hours to a few days, and it rarely interferes with really the most important parts of functioning. Yeah, you might be down and out for a bit, but it's not going to totally destroy your functioning in life. Grief is another form of depression that is not what we're talking about. This is a normal response to a major interpersonal loss, grief. This is more prolonged than reactive sadness, and yet it differs from clinical depression in 3 basic important ways. Despite intense sadness, there is no loss of self-esteem. This is something I don't think a lot of people recognize as being an important differentiation. Also, secondly, the patient relates the sadness to a particular loss. Not just, I don't know, I'm just so depressed, I don't know why. That's clinical. Grief, you know why you're depressed. You've experienced a loss. You're grieving because of that loss. And third, mourning is often a major ingredient for emotional healing in the end. Yeah, it's not pleasant. Nobody goes into something going, oh, I just want to mourn. And yet, if you experience a major interpersonal loss, it is important for you to mourn that loss, to grieve that loss, so that you not get over it, but you get through it. And that is a really important difference. And it's part of a process. So there is also a third category of depression that I want to mention before we go on to the clinical depression that we're talking about. And that is depression that's induced by a medical illness and or medications. This can happen by one or the other or both. Think about how many times you have a medical illness and it is treated with a medication. And I'm talking about something more long-term. When the basic causes of illnesses listed below, and I took that out, I will add an extra list, but there are many things like, even things like thyroid disease and other kinds of illnesses that we don't naturally associate with depression, inducing depression. Medications can exacerbate depression, including things like minor tranquilizers. Lots of times what will happen is a doctor is really most attentive to symptoms of anxiety or agitation. And they fail to recognize that there is an underlying depression. And what they will do then is prescribe a benzodiazepine or minor tranquilizer. And initially this is calming and it helps with the anxiety, but after a week or two, the depression actually will worsen and rear its ugly head to the point where the doctor has to now acknowledge it. If the basic disorder happens to be depression with coexisting anxiety symptoms, it is important to treat the depression. We will discuss this a little bit more at a point where I talk about mixed anxiety depression. But in my experience, it is one of the disorders, like a combined disorder, that fails to be recognized and treated appropriately, especially initially. Now, I have revised these notes fairly significantly since the last time I used any, and that's why I seem to have lost those other disorders, medical illnesses, and I will try to provide that for you. Now, I'm not going to open up all of these links during this video lecture for a couple of reasons. You can do that on your own. They aren't things that I need to explain to you. And these next two links are basically statistics, fairly recent statistics about the prevalence and incidence of depression. So I encourage you to open them, take a quick look, at least if you're interested, read the entire thing, because they do provide some valuable information. So having said that, I am going to move on to the focus of our lectures for today and the next lecture as well. Endogenous or clinical depression, which is a pathological process. It is not easily linked or proportional to external events. I wish my phone wasn't ringing right now. Let me just wait. Thought I had the ringer turned off. Hopefully there'll be no message. This is like getting interrupted in the classroom by somebody coming to the door and knocking and asking you questions. So let's just pretend that's what's happening right now. Okay, I guess we're good to go. Sorry. I've learned not to bother starting all over again just because it's like the classroom, things happen. Okay, now this pathological process of clinical depression or endogenous depression, meaning coming from the inside, is not easily linked or proportional to external events or to drugs one is taking, because this is another thing. So we have to keep remembering that. It is recurring, chronic very often, and incapacitating, so that you have impairment of normal functioning. You experience or can experience a wide spectrum of symptoms. So Actually, clinical depression is really a syndrome or a cluster of symptoms that can be categorized in 5 different ways. Vegetative. Vegetative symptoms would include sleep, appetite, weight, sex drive. Those things, like, now some people sleep way too much. They are sleeping all the time when they're clinically depressed. There are others, however, who can't sleep well. And this increases fatigue, which then exacerbates the depression. Appetite, you may not have any appetite, and which will affect your weight. And sex drive is kind of like a no-brainer. Anyway, second category, cognitive. Attention issues, not able to focus. Frustration tolerance goes down. In other words, it is easy for you to get frustrated. Smaller things that used to not upset you or frustrate you now become issues. Memory, problems with memory. And this is something, again, a lot of people don't recognize, especially younger people. It doesn't matter how old you are, your memory can suffer if you are experiencing endogenous depression. Also, negative distortions. In other words, everything looks bad, everything. You will take something that maybe before you weren't, you didn't consider to be a negative thing, and now suddenly it is. You see things through not rose-colored glasses, but dark glasses. Impulse control, another thing many people don't think about, and that includes more aggression, including aggression against oneself or suicide, or against others to the extent of homicide. Behavioral symptoms, lack of motivation, inability to experience pleasure, anhedonia, which I have on the list below. Fatigability, you tire quickly, much more quickly than you should. Interests decline, you're not interested in things you've always been interested in. And finally, physical symptoms that include headaches, stomach aches, and muscle tension. So in this box, I actually have some different characteristics that I think are important. And mood of sadness, despair, emptiness. Anhedonia, again, if you remember in philosophy that you, I think, probably had to take at some point, hedonism is always wanting to experience pleasure and putting that above yourself. Hedon, so we're talking about pleasure. Hedonia would be ability to experience pleasure, the state of experiencing pleasure. Whereas away or not, hedonia means not able to experience a pleasure. Apathy, you don't care, you have low motivation. Social withdrawal is very common. Excessive emotional sensitivity, it's like, whoa, even small things that somebody might say to you before that would not have evoked any kind of particular emotional response, now it's like, oh, you're just so hypersensitive to things. Negative, pessimistic thinking. No, the glass is not half full, it is half empty, and it's always going to be, and it probably will be completely empty. Pessimistic thinking. Irritability, and again, here I've got listed because I think it's very important for us to think about low frustration tolerance, and finally, suicidal ideation. So those are all things that can be important for us to recognize in individuals. And here is another link you can go to read a little bit more about the symptoms. No need for me to open it right now. But I encourage you to take a look and see if you can benefit from it. It is up to you how you utilize it. Okay. Now, I mentioned before unipolar versus bipolar, and we all have heard about this. If you watch TV for longer than 2 hours in a day, you are going to see at least one, if not more, commercials about some treatment for unipolar depression and for bipolar depression. And it's simply unipolar is you have one extreme of depression. Whereas bipolar, as you probably know, but let's get this listed, is when you cycle between mania and depression. The thing is, a lot of people don't get that the cycle can last a few days. In fact, there's rapidly cycling bipolar now that they feel can happen within hours, or the cycle can last years. The onset for bipolar typically is in the late 20s. However, it can occur at different ages. During that manic phase, and we're going to talk a little more about this later, but there's a high degree of impulsivity. It can lead to disaster. You sometimes have unrealistic self-image, sometimes incredible energy. However, and I'm going to point this out again later because I fear there's a lot of misunderstanding. People get the idea that mania is like, woo, fun, wow, this is great. I have energy. I love everything. I'm going to go do this because I'm awesome. It is not always like that. The mania, the manic phase can be very challenging because you have low degree of control over impulsivity, but that impulsivity might be very negative. You can actually feel more anger that is more overt. You don't necessarily feel great. You don't necessarily love everybody. You don't necessarily think you're the best thing ever. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the section specifically on bipolar, but I wanted to point that out now because I think it's really important. When you swing to the depressive state phase, it is deep and it is incapacitating. So what are the risk and causal factors for major depression, this clinical endogenous depression we're talking about? Well, you gotta probably suspect by now that there is a genetic predisposition in many cases. Also, there's gender differences. There are other things that can occur. And I've listed some that I've found within my research, some of which can be contradicted, but let's take a look here. Some studies show 70% is common among females, adolescent and adult, and that is it's 70% more, I should have said, common than their male counterparts. Now, I'm going to point out something later on that sometimes the symptomology varies depending on gender. Certain sleep patterns and elevated cortisol levels in adolescents predict depression. One thing that has been noted is that if you don't have as much REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, it is more likely that you're going to go on to develop depression, especially when we're talking adolescents. Doesn't mean everybody will. The age peak of onset is about between 20 and 40 years. If you end up taking my neurobiology of childhood mental disorders, excuse me, in the spring, you will see that Whereas it used to be thought children can't be depressed. Guess what? Yes, they can. And in that course, I kind of talk about how I got into a fairly substantial argument with some individuals regarding this back a ways. So anyway, that comes in another class. Marital status, or shall we say permanent partnership status, makes a difference too in some cases. The odds ratio of depression were smaller for females versus males who were, this is interesting, single, widowed, or separated compared to married people or people in a permanent partnership. Think about it. That's a little interesting, isn't it? Regarding age, the odds ratios for depression showed a steady rise with increasing age for those in single and in previous studies, common law relationships compared to married people. That statistic is changing. And if I get a chance, I'll try to see what the most recent stats on that is. But in contrast, the odds ratios for depression declined with age, again, interesting, for those who are widowed, separated, and divorced compared to married or permanently partnered individuals. That kind of flies in the face of some of the more common wisdom out there. Anyway, in 2017, this information was published, okay? And the strength of the interaction used to quantify these moderating effects showed no change from these years when a bulk of this research was done. Okay. Next, as I mentioned earlier, you've got to know genetics are going to likely play a role in at least some occurrence of depression. If a family has a history of depression, it is said by some that you would have 3 times a higher risk. There's an increased tendency for close biological relatives to suffer from the same disorder. In other words, unipolar depression in biological relatives, you are more likely to have that. Bipolar, more likely to have that. In twin studies, and this has been fairly consistent, there's a concordance rate for depression that is 60% for monozygotic and 15% dizygotic, meaning 60% concordance rate is pretty high. And that's for, again, the twins, the monozygotic twins. And you might go, well, that's because they probably grew up in a home that, you know, predisposed because of their environment to depression. Not necessarily, because when you look at twins who were separated at birth and reared in different households with different families, this concordance rate stayed the same. So a British research team recently isolated a gene, and there's more, but this is one I'm mentioning here, that appears to be prevalent in multiple family members with depression. The chromosome, and don't worry, just throwing this out here for you so you're aware of it, 3P25-26 was found in more than 800 families with recurrent depression. Now, that's kind of significant. Scientists believe that as many as 40% of those with depression can trace it to a genetic link. Environmental and other factors make up that other 60%, but that overlap between genetics and environment, you can't ignore that. the two-hit hypothesis. Talk about more later. We'll also talk about postpartum periods of depression. And this is not just a little, I'm sad, I'm blue, I just can't get myself going. There are 3 different stages, and the final one is extremely important. So, possible association with early parental death and other negative life events exists in some of the data. Childhood trauma. And honestly, when I started looking at this, I don't mean to be doing this to like try to give you a hook to take my 398 course in the spring. But one of the things that really changed my presentation of course material was my readings and data that really conclusively showed how early childhood trauma can affect long-term brain changes, which lead to emotional changes and predisposition to things like depression, anxiety, and other types of disorders. So, won't be able to spend too much time on this and the childhood era in this course. Spend a long time on that in the spring. Head injury. I really want to bring this up. We now know so much more about traumatic brain injury and even small episodes, right? The TIAs and other things like little head injuries that nobody thinks you have a concussion or anything too serious, and yet, especially when accumulating, they can absolutely make one more prone to different mood disorders, depression and anxiety. And you might be more prone to depression shortly after suffering the injury. New findings suggest that that risk persists even 50 years later. And honestly, I have family evidence for this myself in my own family, and also the effect of head injury on the development of anxiety disorders. So we'll probably be talking a little bit more about that later. Now, this is interesting, and this study is not in the last 8-9 years. First, I want to say that, but when I found this, I thought it was kind of interesting because Australian researchers found a strong link between smoking cannabis and the development of depression. They were looking at youth between the ages of 14 and 21, and there were 2,000 participants. That's pretty significant N there. And they were followed for 7 years post the beginning of the study. And they did find a big link here, and it was particularly strong, particularly noticeable in the women. So there are a couple of these links which I'll probably not be able to resist opening for you. I'm trying very hard not to do it all the time because I've got a lot of links embedded in this lecture, the depression lecture, because I feel it's really important for you to be aware of all these things, and there's so much that's available for you here. So please take a quick look at these 2 links. I'm not going to open them here. I have enough to talk about, taking enough time. So hang in there with me, please. Maybe you never thought about the possibility that viruses could actually be a cause for depression. Now, this first one I'm talking about is Borna disease. And my guess is the majority of you have never heard of Borna disease. and it isn't very well known. If you are involved with livestock, it's more likely that you're aware of it because it attacks the brains of animals, you know, sheep, cattle, so forth. Now, interestingly, and this is in 1985 when they first started, let me get myself up here, when they first started looking at this particular virus as a possible cause, 265 people were tested for the Borna disease. There were 12 who tested positive. Now, I looked at this more than once because I'm like, this is like crazy because you never see this. But according to these reports, all of these 12 suffered from major depression or bipolar disorder. That is crazy. I want you to be aware a little bit more about this Borna disease without going into a whole lot of time. And so I found a very good link that discusses Borna disease and its relationship to depression. So you will see I'm not making this up. I'm not like, oh man, Putnam's just looking for crazy reasons somebody might get depressed. This is a real thing. And so I really hope that you will take a look at this link. All of these links that I've embedded, as I just mentioned before, and I'm sorry to kind of labor on this, I've spent time looking for, and I'm incorporating them because I think they're useful to you. It's way better than paying $300 for a textbook, which might not even give you all this information anyway. That's kind of how I look at it. Epstein-Barr virus. 20 years ago, you didn't hear that much about Epstein-Barr. Now you hear way more about it. It's considered to be the underlying cause for different things like chronic fatigue syndrome. It's also involved with Hodgkin's disease and some other more commonly known things. So it is the fibromyalgia included on here. For a long time, some of you may know, people were actually saying, the medical community, basically, oh, fibromyalgia, sure. You know what? Get a grip. You're just like being a baby. No, turns out that fibromyalgia is a real thing. Very often, you see these two occurring in the same individual, and that would make sense if they were exposed to Epstein-Barr, had Epstein-Barr virus, and it went this way. So again, here is another link to save you from listening to me for another 10 minutes that you don't want to probably, that I've included in here about this association. Anytime we have one of these links, by the way, you can stop this and go to the link, read it, and then come back. One of the good things about this format, I think. Okay, let's move on and take a look at a couple of these different, I just scrolled down to give myself an idea of how far I wanted to go here. There are physiological abnormalities that have been found in depressives. Remember when we went through the classes of neurotransmitters and I talked about monoamines? Apparently, there are abnormalities in monoamine levels, also serotonin, 5-HT is serotonin, deficiencies. That is one of the things that has driven one of the more popular theories of clinical depression. And we will be talking about that more. But there are also cortical function activity abnormalities that have been observed. These include, one, variation in glucose metabolism. Remember, if you can see what areas of your brain are taking up a lot of glucose, you can see which ones are more active. So, and if you don't see as much glucose metabolism occurring somewhere, then there's less activity. So regions of the left frontal, prefrontal lobe, the temporal and parietal lobes show decreased metabolic activity in many depressed patients, and alternatively, excessive activity in mania. If you damage the left frontal cortex, there is a higher likelihood that you will develop depression associated with that injury to your cortex. Blood flow and PET, positron emission tomography studies have shown bilateral, both sides, reduction of activity in the cerebrum, in your cortex, in your cerebral cortex, in those individuals who are presenting with clinical depression. So remember when up above I said that one of the theories is you have not enough serotonin, 5-HT? Okay, something you need to know about 5-HT is that it is a vasodilator. It dilates blood vessels, which is going to what? Increase the circulation in that area, and with increased circulation, more delivery of glucose and other nutrients. So if you have reduction in cerebral activity, maybe it's because you don't have enough blood flow, so enough glucose, etc. And thus, maybe you don't have enough 5-HT serotonin. So if you give some of that, it will promote vasodilation. That's kind of the logic behind that. Anybody who has either experienced clinical depression or knows somebody or lives with somebody who has severe clinical depression knows that very often cerebral processing, those higher cognitive functions, executive functions, if you will, are not up to where they should be. Poor cerebral processing. That could be at least partially explained by this condition, less 5-HT. Now, hang in with me. We're almost through these sections. Take a breather if you need to. But there are different regions of the brain, right? But there's connections between and among them. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any of the capacities that we do. So there may be times where there is malfunction in some of these connections. And if it's between specific regions of the brain, this type of malfunction could potentially cause, the depression. And I have an article I'll post for you. I don't think I did yet, but I'll post this article so you have access to it. Rethinking the Causes of Depression is the name of it. It is a little dated, but I think it's important because it showed when they actually started going, whoa, maybe this could explain some of the depressive symptoms. Hang on, you might want to know this area 24A. Don't worry, I won't put a map of the brain diagram on and you have to find area 24A. I would never do that to you. But basically, it's a region in the limbic system. Now, remember what the limbic system is important for? It's important for different mood, motivation, the anxiety issues, and all of these other things. And some current evidence suggests that if this area is overactive, interestingly, drug therapy will help. But if it is not overactive, these drugs won't. I said they won't. I meant these drugs won't. Interesting. And I'll tell you, these kinds of findings are really important because if we can make definitive associations like this, it will save time and effort in trying to determine the correct type of treatment. There's a long way to go before we're really there, but it is something to strive for. The biggest increase in blood flow is measured by PET scans when someone cries in a part of the anterior cingulate called area 25. So we're close, 24A, 25. When area 25 is more active, guess what happens? The prefrontal cortex tends to turn off. And some people, I want you to, I'll go back and kind of connect these points in a moment. When area 25 is more active, that prefrontal cortex turns off, and in some people, 24A of the limbic system is stuck on the on position. Oh man, think about it. That means that we've got 24A limbic system going, and that's great sound effects, right? Doesn't exactly sound like that, but anyway, that's whatever. As long as that's overactive like that, the cortex turns off. So the cortex can't even come back and say, calm down, it's okay, now just think about it. Because the cortex is like, nope, not talking to you. That is a problem because now we need to get the electrical circuits back to normal. We need to get that 24A area to go to off and turn on only when it's appropriate. And we need to get the cortex communicating with that area again, okay? So one of the ways it is believed that we have done that is by using electroconvulsive therapy and transcranial magnetic stimulation, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, which uses a magnetic field to kickstart the prefrontal lobes. By the way, ECT or electroconvulsive therapy is much better controlled and has fewer side effects than it used to have. If you watch any movies or anything where when they were first using ECT, it is horrifying. It is absolutely horrifying. And one of my favorite movies to this day remains to be an old movie called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I had read the paperback, the book first, and it was a wonderful book. And then I decided I was going to watch the movie. And I don't know about some of you, but generally when I read a book first, the movie never kind of rises to the same level. And I gotta say, this is one of those cases where book is awesome, movie is awesome. You saw from different perspectives, and it was amazing. And if you have time and you want to watch something, it is worth watching. It's disturbing in cases, different places, but I still put that down as one of my favorite, not because it's happy-go-lucky for sure. Anyway, you saw ECT conducted in that, and it would make you go, I'll never have this, ever. Much different now. So, stress and neuroendocrine function. I'll talk more about this later on. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to do in this section of the depression lectures is talk about the discovery of antidepressants. Back in the 1960s, there was something called reserpine that was used to treat high blood pressure. And one thing that was found out about it was many of the people ended up with a depletion of central nervous system monoamines. Again, remember those categories of neurotransmitters. And 20% or thereabouts of patients developed depression. And I actually have an extra little guy, excuse me while I correct this, just like in class, developed depression. And at the same time, other drugs that increased activity at catecholaminergic synapses, catecholamine and dopamines, remember? Reduce depression. So that led to the monoamine hypothesis of depression. We're going to be going into this more in detail in the theory portion of the lecture notes. But for now, we will look at this. It was thought ultimately that because drugs that depleted monoamines could induce depression, and the known antidepressants at the time, monoamine oxidase inhibitors and tricyclics, boosted these neurotransmitters, leading to the idea that a normal amount of monoamine neurotransmitters was somehow depleted in depressives and needed to be replaced. You needed to boost up those levels. There were problems with that theory, as generally there tends to be with most theories, but at this point, the problems with the theory was that most antidepressant drugs that work at monoamine synapses have immediate effects there, immediate. If you are looking with the awesome imaging techniques we have today, you can see there's immediate changes. But what do we all know about these medications? Individuals who start taking them do not experience relief from their depression for at least a couple of weeks. And the rule of thumb is generally don't expect full effect, positive effect from these drugs for at least 6 weeks. That's kind of the ballpark idea of range that we talk about, I guess. Anyway, so that's a problem. And so there's an inconsistency of the time course of treatment and resultant effects on mood. So there might be some slow developing consequence of this drug that is really what is important. Another problem was some drugs that block monoamine reuptake, which would then increase the availability of monoamines in the synapse, don't have antidepressant effects. Some therapies do not block monoamine reuptake, yet are antidepressants. And fourth, measurements of monoamines and their metabolites in depressed people are not always abnormal. So this really impacted the development of treatment, though. And I think I would like to stop at this point. And in part 2 of the depression video lectures, we will start with the development of treatment, kind of taking a step off of this previous information about monoamines. Okay, so I will see you sort of in the next part of the depression notes. So let's stop this. And again, move along with these notes in this video lecture and the ones to come at your pace. As long as you have this done and have the ability to study from it before the next written exam, then the review sheet is posted, which will be about 1 week before the written exam, you will be okay. It's one reason that I've tried so hard to build in this flexibility. I know that you all have a lot of different things going on, and I want you to benefit from this course. And so you utilize your time and take advantage of the video lectures and the notes that are posted when it is best for you. And hopefully that'll help you progress in this course, because